Okay, so I'm going to get us started here. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for logging on. My name is Collier Curran, and I am the Association Manager for PHCC of Long Island. I would like to thank you all for logging on today and for continuing to support PHCC through these difficult times. We have been working hard behind the scenes to ensure that 2021 will be an active year for PHCC, both in the time of virtual events like these, as well as when things start to open up later this year. I can't think of a more timely webinar than discussing ways to keep your workplace compliant with the constantly evolving COVID restrictions. Our presenter, Barbara DeMatteo, has prepared a thorough and informative presentation covering topics like whether employers can require vaccines, voluntary FFCRA benefits, and returning to work after foreign or domestic travel. Barbara has over 35 years of human resources experience supporting businesses across many industries, so we're in great hands tonight. Before I hand it over to Barbara, I want to remind you that you can type questions using the Q&A function, and Barbara will be able to take your questions either throughout the presentation or at the end. Feel free to submit questions as you think of them. I would also like to announce that PHCC of Long Island is planning on returning to in-person meetings as soon as we can, most likely by the end of May. So keep an eye out for an email from us as soon as we have those details finalized. We are really looking forward to seeing our members in person once again. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Barbara DeMatteo, Director of HR Consulting at Portnoy, Messenger, Pearl & Associates.
Thank you very much, Collier, and hello, everyone. I hope that you and all of your families have been well and that we are continuing to do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. This is a timely topic, and even as the days go on, there are nuances and new news that's even happening today. So I'm going to be sharing that information with you, and I'm very eager to read your questions. And I'm going to look to see if I can answer them before the end of our workshop tonight. Our webinar tonight. Throughout the course of today's class webinar, I'm going to be sharing with you links that I'm going to pop up on the screen, and I'm also going to be talking about some links. What I'd like to do is I'm going to provide those to Collier by tomorrow, so this way she can forward them all on to you, and you don't have to look to make copies of or start to jot down all of those websites, because I'm going to provide that to you. So I'm eager to talk about that. Let's get started. COVID-19 in the workplace, what now? Whose workplaces have not been affected, either for good or for bad? It's just been an unbelievable year, and I can't believe that it actually is a year that we're coming up on. And look at the statistics. When we look at these statistics and we're saying 28.7 million people in the United States and over 516,000 deaths. This is information as of yesterday, and look at the numbers on the bottom of the screen as it relates to New York. That's huge, and I'm going to bet that those cases and those deaths have affected each and every one of us in one way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly, and that is absolutely a challenge, and that is absolutely the reality. So what we're going to talk about today is, can we require vaccines? How does the voluntary benefit apply? What are the required quarantine periods for contact and close contact with an infected person? And there's a new update on that I'm going to share with you. And then returning to work after domestic and international travel. Governor Cuomo actually made an update on domestic travel today, so I'm going to share that with you as well. So let's start off with, can employers require vaccines? Well, the short answer is yes, and the long answer is, well, so let's talk about that. Okay, so first off, you are an essential business. Okay, you are in the construction business. It's important to understand where you fall in the food chain, because it all has to do with who's eligible for vaccines and who is responsible to do certain things as it relates to travel and opening up. A few weeks ago, the governor added taxi drivers and restaurant workers to the vaccine list. When construction is added, I think we're going to need to consider the time that employees are going to be required to be out in order to get a vaccine, if they're going to choose to, or if you're going to require it. President Biden announced that by the end of May, everyone's going to have access to a vaccine. So we're going to need to think about, how do we need to plan that? How easy is it for employees to get those vaccine appointments? And is that going to be a disruption in your day? So it's something to think about for the next 2 months as it relates to planning and scheduling, because I know that is all about how the construction business and your business works. Everything is on a timeline and everything is well planned out. So anything that's outside of that can be a challenge for us. Well, let's talk about requiring vaccines, okay? First off, can you mandate it or can you encourage it? Well, if you decide to mandate, the things that you need to consider are the requirements to protect the information that you obtain from the employee. So you never run afoul of having medical information that could potentially be used to take an adverse action against an employee. Some employers are actually arranging for on-site vaccines and for vaccines to come into the workplace. But you still have to think about whether you're going to mandate it or not. If you are going to mandate it, you need to think about that it could affect your workers' comp and it could affect workers' comp claims. There are already situations where employees are saying, well, I don't feel good for a day or two after the vaccine. And God forbid, you never know how an individual is going to actually react to the vaccine. If something tragic happens, could they tie it back to your requirement that they got the vaccine and hold you accountable for that? So we're hearing more and more employers are not mandating it. That's what we're hearing. We are hearing that more and more employers are encouraging it. And this is what I want you to think about. So if you're going to encourage vaccines, consider how to approach your workforce. Consider launching an informational and an educational program. And the CDC, I have here on the slide a link to a CDC communication program, which is pretty darn good. They did a really nice job of putting together pages and graphics and information that you can easily customize to your own business and decide how you want to roll that out to your employees. So whether you decide to mandate or encourage vaccines, I suggest that you take a look at this link. Again, I'll get this to you tomorrow through Collier and see what it's all about. And I think that you're going to find that there is really good information here. Now, some employers are also providing financial incentives for employees to go and get vaccines. They may consider that it's paid time out, or they may give a monetary benefit of a small amount. They may give a $20, $25, or whatever dollar amount Amazon gift card. It may be a day off to go and get the vaccine, because actually by the time they head out to get it and decide to come back or able to come back, it may be a whole day anyhow. But think about whether you want to pay for that or not. But you have to be careful that the incentive cannot be ruled as coercive and thus being ruled as you're mandating it, which can be can create liabilities for you. So, a water bottle, a gift card of modest value is okay. But where I've seen employers offering annual gym memberships or airline tickets when travel opens up, that's not appropriate. That's beyond just an incentive. That can be construed as coercion. Now, when an employee gets a vaccine, you can require the employee provide you with proof of that vaccine. They don't have to give you any other information. You don't have to ask them about how they felt, did they have any adverse effects, any of that, because that's personal health information, which you really don't want to know for a lot of reasons. But if you want to ask the employee for a copy of that, they're going to give you a card and you can easily keep that in your file. This way it keeps you up to date about what's going on, because that may also impact when people are going to need to be revaccinated in the future, because one of the things that none of us know is how long the vaccine is actually going to last. So we're still in the beginnings of all of this. The vaccine is just about getting out. No one knows what's going to happen 6, 9, 12 months down the road, if it's going to be like a flu shot or if it's going to be like a one-time shot. So this is something that we're going to be learning about, but it's really important to think about the communication with all of your employees. If you mandate it, it's going to create some problems. There are already lawsuits against companies where employees claim they got COVID from the workplace because the employer didn't provide protections. We may have heard early in April of last year, an employee died and the family was suing Walmart because the employee got sick from COVID from the workplace and it was proven and he passed away. So if an employee gets sick and worse and they can prove that it happened from the workplace, you could be liable. So let's think about and make sure that when you are making a decision to either mandate or encourage it, that you're making those decisions carefully and cautiously, and you're applying that consistently across all of your employees. So if you're going to require it, well, think about what the best practices are. And here's what we suggest. Regardless of whether you require the vaccines or not, you should have a vaccine or a COVID coordinator. It's just a really darn good idea. And why? Well, in the event, because we don't know what's going to happen down the road, that an employee files suit, we're going to have to scramble to say, what information did we communicate? When did we communicate it? How often was it posted? When did we let people know about either close contact issues or people who had COVID, or what the practices were within the buildings and the facilities that we were working within? And we're going to scramble. So it's a good idea to gather all of that stuff now if you haven't already done it. And I call it calling your COVID book, whether it's hard copy or whether it's electronic. Keep it by date and make sure that you're maintaining that as being updated. If you decide to take some of the CDC stuff and send it out, make note of the date that you sent each of these posters out, how you sent it out, and who you sent it to. If you're going to require vaccines or mandate them, have one person who's going to communicate information about that vaccine. It's important to make sure, as you've heard me say so many times in human resources and when we've had our labor attorneys speak with you, it's important to make sure we're treating people consistently. So it's important to make sure that that message is coming out consistently from that one person or two people. Develop some sort of a written plan or have a policy. On this date, we made this decision for these reasons, and here's how we're going to handle it. And then abide by it. And then educate your employees. Whether or not you are going to require those vaccines, make sure that you are opening up and maintaining that communication. You know, I've seen in so many places, the posters are up, but now they're getting all dog-eared. You know, people are walking by them. Some people have doodled on them, and it kind of becomes something that you don't see anymore. Refresh it. This is an important thing. We have 516,000 people in the United States who have died. Whether we believe that or not, it's still a fact. And we don't want that happening to somebody who works for us. And more importantly, you work so hard for your businesses. I don't want to create an opportunity for there to be liability for you. Now, if you do require a vaccine, we have to make sure that we are making we are aware of the requirement to make an accommodation for employees who are saying that they're not going to take the vaccine because of a medical reason or a sincerely held religious belief, whether you know about that religion or whether you don't. As long as I have a sincerely held religious belief that I should not be taking the vaccine, you have to accept that on face value. Now, if an employee asks for an accommodation as it relates to the requirement to take the vaccine, what's going to come into play is the same interactive and cooperative dialogue that's required for any accommodation that an employee is going to ask you for. It's required by New York State. And this interactive and cooperative dialogue helps to determine whether your organization can provide a reasonable accommodation, provided it does not create an undue hardship for the company, and it doesn't pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others in the workplace or to the employee. Now, this overall is a good practice to follow. It means you're having a conversation with. It doesn't mean a one-sided, the employee writes something, you write back no or yes, and that's it. It's actually a dialogue, and this is important because in the event there's ever an Americans with Disabilities Act claim, what you're going to be asked for is, where's the documentation of this interactive dialogue? I think you've all heard me talk about documentation in the past too, right? That's going to help to prove the actions that you've taken. So it's really important that when you have this accommodation conversation, that employees know that they are not going to be retaliated against for either having the conversation, for saying that they may not take the vaccine, or for whatever reason. So, we have accommodation forms that we have for employees. So it's a nice, clear process, and it opens up the conversation. You can use similar stuff in a letter to an employee, because ultimately you have to provide an answer in writing to an individual. So what we want to think about as it relates to this is, if you're going to require it, go ahead, be consistent, but make sure that you're making exceptions and accommodations to individuals based upon their specific issue. Okay. So what we did is that we talked a little bit about, can we require it? Well, yeah, and well, just make your decisions carefully and document what you are doing. That is so important. Okay. Now let's talk about how the voluntary FFCRA benefit applies. And let's start off with a little bit of history. So let's go back to March of last year, 12 months ago. As a summary and as an update and just a reminder, on March 18th of 2020, New York State started off, before the federal government did, New York State started off by enacting legislation authorizing sick leave for employees who were subject to a mandatory or precautionary order of isolation due to COVID-19. That provided paid and unpaid sick leave with access to expanded paid family leave and temporary disability, depending upon the size of the employer. And all employees, regardless of the size of the employer, were entitled to job protection upon return from the leave. We're going to review this later because this is still in effect. There was no sunset on this law, so it is still there. But then what happened on April 1st is the federal government kicked in and said, hey, wait a second, we realize this is bigger than the states. So we're now going to provide money. And basically it was free money to employers, because this law said, well, we're going to provide employers tax credits if you provide monies to an employee under certain criteria and certain amounts, and the employer got the money back in tax credits. So it was a win-win for everybody. The employee was paid for the period of time that they were out. The employer paid the money right out of payroll and got the tax credits back pretty much immediately. So it was a great, great, good news. Now, what also happened is that expired on December 31st of 2020. The required FFCRA benefits for you to pay ended on December 31st of 2020. However, on January 1st of 2021, the FFCRA benefit has been extended, but it's voluntary. It's up to you. But I'm thinking, why not do it? You're getting the money back. There's no loss to you. Right now, as of today, the benefit is going to run through any pay that you pay to employees through March 31st of this year. So we've got another 28, 29 days. It is expected, because we saw the Senate, what was passed in the House, is that they are looking to extend this with money and with time. So expect that the voluntary extension will still continue. It may become mandatory. We don't know what's going to happen in the Senate, but expect that this will probably extend, because employees are still going to be out of work. It's a financial hardship both to the employee and to the employer. So the federal government's going to be coming in and kicking in to say, here's what we can do. So I just want to be clear about this voluntary extension. Right now it's through March 31st. It probably is going to be extended. Let's wait for that. And right now, if you continue to pay money to an employee based upon the rules, which we're going to go over in just a little bit, you will get that money back in tax credits. Lily, you have a question. Can you unmute?
You could also type your question into the Q&A box if you'd prefer.
Okay. So Lily, until we get you live and able to hear you and unmuted, if you can chat and type your question into the Q&A, we'll make sure that I answer your question. Okay, now let's talk about the benefits that are available to employees. Now, on April 1st of 2020, when the FFCRA came into play, they said that employees can be paid money for these if they are out for these 6 reasons. Okay, and I'm going to break them down because there are 2 thresholds of dollars that I want to talk about. And we're breaking it down from 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so first, if an employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID, so they got a positive test, they have been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine related to COVID-19 because they've either been exposed or they have it, or they are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and they are seeking a medical diagnosis, the employee is eligible for paid sick leave for up to 2 weeks, 80 hours, at the employee's regular rate of pay. So they're going to get their regular rate of pay, not to exceed $511 a day, which is probably going to apply to most employees. Now, the caveat here that we want to make sure that we are suggesting that you follow is always direct the employee to go to a healthcare provider, not to go and get a test. Everyone says go get a test, and the employee comes back and gets a test, and we get calls saying, when can the employee come back? And I say, I don't know, I'm not a physician. It's not at the end of my name. I'm not that smart. Send them back to a healthcare provider, because the healthcare provider is going to know by talking with the employee when they were exposed, when they started to have symptoms, when they got the test, when they got the results back, and they're going to say the employee can come back on X date. That's really important for you. Because if you have been giving out FFCRA money on a mandatory basis through December 31st, or you have been or plan to do it now through March 31st, and hopefully later it's going to continue, if you're ever audited, you're going to be asked for documentation. So that healthcare provider note is really helpful. So please change your direction to employees. And instead of saying, go get a test, go to a healthcare provider and come back with a note. That's really important. Okay. Now let's go to these next 3 reasons why a person can come out. And really, I'm only going to focus on number 4 and number 5, because we all believe number 6 was kind of a placeholder if the Department of Health and Human Services needed to add something, because it really kind of doesn't make sense. So if an individual, if I am caring for someone, or I'm caring for my child whose school or place of daycare is closed for reasons of COVID, and now I need to be home, these individuals are eligible for, first off, paid sick leave for up to 2 weeks at 2/3 the employee's regular rate of pay. And if this individual is caring for a child, this benefit can extend for up to 12 weeks. So this is a 2-week period of time for number 4, and it's up to 12 weeks for number 5. We also have to understand that the number 5 reason can be done intermittently, because we've all been hearing about or experienced schools and places of childcare where they are closed for a half a day, or there is a combination of remote and on-site learning. So the period of time by which the employee is going to be home earning that pay because they have to care for the child and can't work, that actually may result in more than a 12 calendar week period of time, because they can do that intermittently. Okay. So when we think about this, this is the summary of what we just talked about, and this is how it actually applies. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the voluntary benefits and what happens beyond the FFCRA, and how do the New York State benefits come into play? Because remember, New York State was one of the first states that came out with a benefit on March 18th of 2020, before the April 1st date that the federal government came out to play. And again, there is no sunset date on this legislation. So how does this actually work? Well, if you take a quick look at this chart, it's important to take a look at the column that applies to your size company. Okay. So first off, if you have 10 or fewer employees on January 1st of 2020, and you had a net income of $1 million or less, you were required to provide unpaid sick leave. You are not required to provide New York State required paid sick leave, and the employee would be eligible for paid family leave and disability, and they can get 100% of salary if their earnings were under $150,000. And in all cases, everyone has job protected leave. Now, if you had 10 or fewer employees, the rules changed a little bit. Now you're required to provide 5 days of paid leave to the employee. If you're 11 to 99 days, again, it's still 5 days. If you're 100 employees up to 499 employees, you're required to pay 10 work days. And employers with 500 plus are required to provide 10 work days of pay. This paid sick leave does not come out of the employee's accrued sick time. This is an additional piece of money that comes out of your pocket. So you're not getting tax credits back on this, and you had not. And if it applies now, you're not going to get tax credits back on it. But you're required to pay this, and you can't have it count against the employee's accrued sick time or paid time off or vacation, whatever it may be. New York PFL and disability benefits, this is handled through your workers' comp or your disability carrier. So I want you to think New York paid family leave. Because when you go onto that site, and I'll share some of that information with you just shortly, there is a specific New York paid family leave form that applies to COVID issues. Okay. Now, what's also happened is that there has been recent guidance as of a few weeks ago this year, where New York State said there's guidance on the use of COVID-19 sick leave because there was a concern that employees are going to game the system and keep on getting time out. And employers were saying, how many times am I supposed to give somebody 5 days of sick days or 10 days of sick days? Because this is coming out of my pocket. This is affecting my bottom line. So I'm going to share this entire document with you when I give it to Collier tomorrow. And what this guidance talks about, ultimately in these 3 large paragraphs, is that an employee can only receive the New York benefit 3 times. And 2 of those reasons have to be because they have a positive COVID test. So the other reason can be, I don't feel well, I was exposed. The other 2 reasons have to be because they have an actual COVID test. So this is protection for you, that you're not going to be paying out of nose and out of your pockets for an indefinite period of time. And that is important because it clearly says it here in the last paragraph. In no event shall an employee qualifies for sick leave for more than 3 orders of quarantine or isolation. The second and third orders have to be based on a positive COVID test in accordance with the prior 2 paragraphs. When you read through it and you see that, this is the paragraph to really focus on, because this is your protection. So when an employee says, I keep on wanting to be out, that's not going to happen. If they are, then they're not going to be paid. Okay? So these are the documents that you should be taking a look at. These are the New York paid family leave documents that are online. These are handled through your workers' comp or your disability carrier. And as I said before, these very clearly are for COVID-19 quarantine and isolation. The other ones that have nothing to do with COVID are for New York paid family leave that is provided because I'm taking care of somebody else. Okay? So here it can be because they're taking care of themselves or for someone else. And again, I'm going to get you those links. Oh, phew, that's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Well, let's go a little bit further and let's talk about the required quarantine periods for contact and close contact with a COVID infected person. Okay. So what's also happened is that there is some very good guidance out there. Again, I'm going to get this to Collier tomorrow. She'll forward it on to all of you. And what you've got here is we've got not only the CDC website, we've got the New York State Department of Health, which talks about on May 31st, they provided some guidance. And the New York State Department of Health also provided some guidance on December 26th. There's some additional guidance, which has just recently come out as well. And what it says here is on the bottom, please continue to direct the employee to go to a healthcare provider. That's so important because as we start talking about the requirements and when a person can comes back, I don't want to remember this, and I'm sure you don't want to either. I'd rather have a doctor's note. Because in New York State, it says that I have tested positive and I am asymptomatic. I can return to work after completing 10 days of isolation from the onset of my symptoms or 10 days of isolation after the first positive test if I remain asymptomatic. How am I going to figure that out with an employee? Let the doctor tell me. Right now, if I've got close contact, which is defined as being within 6 feet for 10 or 15 minutes or more, starting 48 hours before the illness onset, until the time the person was isolated, then that person has to quarantine. Again, we're not doctors. Send the individual to a healthcare provider. So this way you can get the note about when they can return to work. Now, New York State says for essential employees, which you are all essential businesses, is that if I have had close contact and I am asymptomatic, I can return to work without a quarantine. I don't know how many of you really want to do that. Because I'm going to say to my coworkers, I've come in close contact. I don't have any symptoms, but hey, the law allows me to come back to work. I propose that that's going to be a challenge. Because if I'm a coworker, I'm not going to want to work next to you. Because now there's a chance that I may get infected. So think about implementing your own quarantine periods, which you can do. For example, in our office, the quarantine period by law is 10 days. We have implemented 14. That's it. And that's across the board, regardless of position, because that's how safe our organization wants us to be from anybody who has had any close contact. So when you see in these documents that I'm going to send out to you from the CDC and the New York State Department of Health, you're going to see that they're pretty much following one another. That New York State has really gone to follow what the CDC is saying, which really makes it a lot easier for us to follow. Now, let's talk about returning to work after domestic and international travel. We all know that this was a real big issue at the end of last year. We had Thanksgiving, we had the holidays, we had December, we had New Year's. People were starting to travel. People are also seeing that there are quite the good deals to get on airlines and to go to various places around the world. So people are starting to travel. We all realize that. You are essential businesses. And there was news in today's press conference with Governor Cuomo, where he is saying that if there is any domestic travel, when an employee comes back to New York, he is eliminating the quarantine period. There's still a requirement to get tested on the 4th day, but he is eliminating that quarantine period. So that's kind of good news. This is stuff that's evolving. But at the same time, we have to remember that the vaccine requirement is still going to come into play, okay? The vaccine and the quarantine period in New York State will still apply to anybody coming back from international travel. So yes, you do have the right to say to an employee, are you going away? When you're coming back, what's going on? And when are you returning? And is it domestic or international travel? I'm also hoping that 100% of you are still having 100% of your employees respond to the daily questionnaire about whether or not they've been exposed, if they had the virus, if they traveled outside of New York State, was it international or domestic travel, that you're asking all of those questions, because that's really important and that's right now required by New York law. That came out back in March of last year. That came out with those other documents where you were required to develop and write and have a safety plan. So when we talk about domestic travel, as of March 3rd, I read it on his website. I read the press release that as of today, he's saying that there's not going to be any more quarantine. Now, let's wait for the actual document to come out. But that's kind of some good news for all of you, okay? And here are the rules about returning to work. So here we're talking about travel outside of New York State. New York State would permit you to return to work immediately and require a test on the 4th day. Or The company requires a quarantine for 3 days, but New York State still requires the 4th day test. Or a company can require quarantine for 14 days, and New York State still requires that 4th day test. There are different rules for teachers, school children, school employees, and childcare workers, but what we're talking about here is travel. Now, you may have some employees who can work remotely if they may have been under that period of quarantine. It could be under your quarantine. If they can work remotely, they're to be paid for the time worked. Employees who are under a state quarantine and cannot work remotely are eligible for those FFCRA benefits. Now, what we're also talking about here is that employees who may be under a company's quarantine and can't work remotely, that would be unpaid time, and they can use accrued and unused PTO, vacation, or sick time. So what we've talked about is we've talked about a lot as it relates to the essential businesses. And we've talked a lot about what the requirements are. And many people are getting frustrated because the rules keep changing. Well, yeah, and I'm kind of glad that they are, because it means that this is something that is on the forefront of everybody's minds. And the states and the federal government are listening to what's going on, and they're adapting. And they're adapting as quickly as they can. So as frustrating as it may be for us that the rules are changing, you know, we've never been here before. So this is kind of the first time, and I know we're going to be learning a lot from this. Hopefully this never happens to us again. Last time it did was in 1918. So we need to really think about how much value there is to this. Now, one of the things that came out from the CDC on February 10th, that wasn't even in this presentation, but I want to share it with you, is if a person is vaccinated and has then been exposed to somebody with COVID, are they required to quarantine? So this again is something new. So if a vaccinated person with an exposure to somebody who is suspected or has confirmed COVID, they are not required to quarantine if they meet 3 criteria, all 3. Number 1, they are fully vaccinated. 2 weeks following the receipt of a second dose in a 2-dose series, or 2 weeks following the receipt of a 1 dose in a single-dose vaccine. So 2 weeks after full vaccination. And are within 3 months following the receipt of the last dose in the series. So right now, they're saying, we don't know what's going to happen 4 months from now. We don't know if it's still going to be effective in people. Right now, they're extending it for 3 months. And the third criteria is they have remained asymptomatic since the current COVID-19 exposure. So right now, if an individual has been exposed, they're quarantined for 10 days. Now the CDC is saying, and New York is supporting this, if I've gotten my vaccinations, I'm within 3 months of getting my vaccine, and I continue to be asymptomatic, I don't have to quarantine and I can come back to work. So these are things that are evolving. These are things that are evolving and that are very valuable. Okay. Now I saw that there was a question that came up here. Not sure when to ask this. We have 3 employees in quarantine. 1 tested positive this past Saturday. 2 were in close contact with this employee and have taken the test. They're awaiting results. All employees are asymptomatic. I will pay them and assign the FFCRA code to receive the credit. Am I able to request the employees participate in online training sessions while in quarantine? Sure. So if an individual can work remotely while they are in quarantine, you're going to pay them for the time that they're out, and that comes out of your regular payroll. If they cannot work, then they're eligible for the FFCRA benefit, and you're also going to ask them for not only the test results, but also the doctor's note that's going to talk about when they can return to work. I hope that's helpful, Elizabeth. Okay, now I have a question from Anthony. If I go away for 10 days and my company requires me to quarantine for 4 days, are they supposed to pay me for the 4 days that they mandated me to stay away? If it is the employer's requirement and you cannot work remotely, then I believe that comes out of your PTO time. Does that help? I hope that helps. What other questions can I answer? Okay, terrific. Well, I know that I've gone through a lot of information. It's important to understand that things are changing. I promised to Collier, as things are going to be updated as it relates to the law, that I'm going to keep her updated so this way she can get the information out to you. And Collier, I'm hoping that this is helpful to everyone. Would you like to finish up with anything, or for anybody to ask any questions?
Yeah, so if anybody has any last minute questions, definitely feel free to type those into the Q&A, or you could raise your hand and we can have you ask the question. As Barbara mentioned, check your email sometime tomorrow for a list of links as well as any other information from this presentation that you could take with you. Of course, if there are any major updates, we will let you know about that as well. But if there are no extra questions, I want to thank you all for logging on. This was great. Thank you, Barbara, for a great presentation. And yeah, I hope you all stay safe and be well.
And if you have questions, reach out to me. Thank you very much. Wish you well, everybody.